Record. All right. Hello. Welcome to episode 5 of the Positive Masculinity podcast. I'm here
Hello.
with my guest, Olivia. You can introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, I'm Olivia. I'm a coworker of Davin's, and I'm pretty excited to be talking about positive masculinity and whatever we talk about on the B-roll. Um, so I don't know. I guess a little bit about me is that I moved here from Egypt with my family when I was 4, and although I see myself as Egyptian American, I go back and forth on what it means being a citizen of those two countries. I grew up in LA ever since we moved here, and then I moved down to San Diego to La Jolla for college. I went to UCSB and I studied biochem and cell biology. And I also did a minor in gender studies and an almost minor in psychology. Um, and then I started working in the biotech space. Um, I would say I've always been pretty interested in politics and just current events. So you really have some sort of opinion about what's going on.
Cool. Yeah. We talk a lot about like random current events, as well. I guess it's not random because they're current events, but stuff at work a lot. And I appreciate that. Like, I feel like I can like bounce things off of you. Yeah. So the first question: what do you think it means to be masculine?
You know, just the subject of me being on this podcast for like a 6-hour conversation with one of my best friends yesterday. And at the very end of it, we kind of arrived at what I've always thought masculinity is, which is it's just a social construct, and it means whatever we let it mean. And I guess that is oversimplified because there's always different spheres of influence that will want it to mean different things for those groups' own benefits. But I don't know. I've been struggling with getting a hard definition about masculinity because while I can identify things that are toxically masculine and even toxically feminine, every time I try to pick an attribute that is positively masculine, it just feels like it's something that is good for everybody, despite gender. And, I thought about gender a lot, and masculinity and femininity is so intertwined with that. And even gender is, not so binary and not as defined as we think it is. And so I think there is a societal definition of masculinity, and it's very easy to look at characteristics that one might have and based on society's definition say that's positive or that's toxic. And does that answer your question at all?
Kinda. I was trying to ask. I'm trying to get your definition though, not just like the broad, like general societal definition.
Okay. I can do that. I think masculinity means being secure in yourself, and being confident in whatever it is that you find different or exceptional about you without having to without having to put others down for any of those qualities. And I guess it's easier for me to give examples than definitions because I think being able to express and understand and display your emotions, that's something that's very positively masculine. And I feel like you can't really be masculine if you don't understand emotions in general. Um,
I would fight back on that. Not that that's a good thing, right?
mhm.
But yeah, I think that there's definitely like ways to be masculine without understanding emotions. Unfortunately, um,
Fair, fair. I feel like maybe that's in my definition of
okay,
masculinity,
all right,
and I do understand that, as part of our generation, and just as part of the younger population in general, we are constantly trying to redefine what masculine is, because there's plenty of things that society deems positively masculine that are so toxic. You know, just labeling um, being a provider as masculine has got so many um, just resounding effects in our society as a whole. And there is no need for that. So I feel like our generation has started to define masculinity away from the financial aspect of things. And we've started to define masculinity as understanding your emotions and owning up to your emotions. Um,
okay, yeah, that's good. That's a good answer, I think. Yeah, I talked about the provider thing on a different episode of the podcast, and I find it interesting that like the only way that they talk about it is like the financial way to provide, because there's more than one way to provide, right? Like if you're, let's say, you're married and your wife makes way more money than you. Okay, is it really like providing if you continue to work just to say that you work and bring home money, like, and you have a kid, like, or let's say you have a kid, right? Should you make your wife quit her way higher paying job so she can take care of the kid? Like, is that like
right. It makes no sense, right?
right?
And I think that's a great point to make, because I do think that, like, as we've started to uncouple masculinity from finances, it's opened up the opportunity for men to be providers in other aspects, to be more emotionally involved and to be more, I guess, socially involved. It's not, there is no stigma about being involved in raising your child anymore. And I think that's a good thing for everyone. I think it's a tragedy that men of the past, in order to be seen as masculine, didn't get to interact with their children, or, you know, stigmatized away from that. I think that's just sad all around. And so you're right, like, there is no need for provider to mean financial provider. It hasn't really meant that for most of human history. I think we're just currently wrapped up in that, since we live in a capitalist society, and so that structures the way we think about everything.
I think it's not necessarily the capitalism. It's this like post like patriarchal feudalism that we live in, right? It's like we're still dealing with like the remnants of that, right? If you really think about like a lot of these feudalistic societies, like there are societies on Earth where kings and queens still have power today, right? I mean, technically they do in Britain, even though they never use it, right? So
Yeah, it's interesting how we can't seem to let go of those sorts of power dynamics. And you're right, it is like the patriarchal power structures behind it all that reinforce that. No.
yeah, it's very interesting, and a lot of people I've heard people say like, well, there was queens that held a lot of power, and I'm like, they still kind of act as a patriarch, right? Like, there's no real difference besides that, like they're the ethnic majority, they're super rich, they hold like generational wealth and power, and they're just like they're one demographic step removed. It's like, is that really that different ultimately? Like, yeah, maybe people will say, talk a little more crap to them, but like they can only talk so much crap or they're gonna
Yeah, and of course they have that like unquestionable, well, their royalty attached to it. So that was also a big plus. But you're right, they were only one step removed, or one attribute removed away from that traditional masculine role. So, you know, every once in a while a queen would fill it, and it wouldn't be all that crazy because she's already wealthy, she's already powerful.
yeah.
So it's not that different for her. But you see, that goes back to how I was saying, like, I struggle to define qualities that are masculine, because if a queen displayed those same qualities, then, well, there you go. She can be empowered. She's powerful. Does that make her masculine? Like, does that necessarily mean those attributes are masculine? Or do we just tend to attribute those positive qualities to men? And if women start to display them, typically, it's discouraged because those aren't what you would attribute to feminine.
I would say contemporarily, yes. Right? But, like, now, obviously looking back, it's like, no, not really. But, like, at the time, yeah, it's like Catherine the Great, we'll say, right? She was definitely displaying some qualities that basically everyone in Russia would say are more masculine, probably, right? But again, yeah, us looking back, like, yeah, she didn't seem to have any, like, hyper masculine hobbies, from what I understand, right? Like, she still, like, did all the normal lady things, I guess, whatever what you want to call them, right? She just, ruled her kingdom with an iron fist, just like everyone else did.
Any other ruler would.
Yeah.
And it kind of, it makes sense to me that you say she didn't have these hyper masculine hobbies. I'm not too familiar with Catherine the Great, but just because she was woman powered doesn't mean that she wasn't still confined to the spheres of life that women had to occupy. So sure, she had women hobbies, but she got to rule. And I'm curious about which qualities you would say are masculine, because I mean, just being bloodthirsty, while you do see it more historically in men, which may just be because, men write history for the most part, I struggle to call that a masculine quality. See, because I think anyone can be bloodthirsty.
I think that one in particular, like the bloodthirsty aspect or the aggressive aspect, it is a result of testosterone, and in general, especially historically, it's been mostly men with testosterone, right? With the testosterone, and I think the increase of testosterone that you get from being male usually results in more aggression, which would result in more bloodthirstiness. So I think that one is kind of like a more masculine quality. That's like unfortunate, but yeah.
So just biologically masculine.
Mm-hmm. Like there are things that are going to be like, I think even if we did our best to just destroy gender, some people are gender abolitionists, right? I think there would still be a disparate outcome in like males and females and how they operate in society, just based off of their hormones.
Yeah, I think I can agree with that. It may be that men are more aggressive on average because they have to deal with different biologies. A fair point. I don't even know what question we're on.
We veered off, but we're still talking about masculinity.
We do that.
So, what do you think is your most positive masculine quality?
My most positive masculine quality. I guess I would say, you see, because I struggle to give any quality the whole masculine or feminine title, this is hard, but I guess
do like traditionally masculine. That's what I probably should adjust those questions. What is your most positive traditional masculine quality?
I think when I need to be, I can be pretty assertive. Whereas sometimes my first instinct is to not, and I feel like that is because I have been socialized to be less assertive. But the fact that I'm just like, well, no, that's weird, I'm going to do it anyway, I feel like that would make it my most masculine quality, because it feels like the quality that society tends to push women away from the most.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. There is like an epidemic of women who just like are not assertive enough, right? And I think that's bad, right? Especially because we don't raise men to have like a good understanding of other people's emotions, and so unless they like unless they get a direct answer, they're not going to be able to pick up on some of the like a non assertive no or a non assertive like not the answer that they're seeking, and then that's obviously not a good combination of things to happen, especially in certain contexts.
Yeah, that's definitely a double whammy of not being able to communicate effectively across gender lines, just because you're right, men are taught to be confident in themselves and to just believe things at face value because most things will be. But for women, we're definitely socialized to monitor and handle people's emotions. And so that's always part of what we're considering when we're interacting with people. And so it won't be as straightforward, but it's because we've learned to consider others in that way. But that doesn't make for the best communication for someone who hasn't been socialized that way.
Yeah, it's like the perfect storm. There's definitely times when I would like talk to a guy friend. I mean, when I'm younger, I was that guy sometimes. Every guy's been that time. But like, I've definitely been like, hey man, like, you're really like creeping her out, right? And just watching the guy just be like what? What do you mean? Like, there's no intention to be creepy or do anything. Like he thought he was in the clear, and I was like, no, not at all. And it's like it's just such a defeating feeling too. But
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure. And on the other side, it's usually just as uncomfortable because
it might be more.
Depending on how creepy, I'm not going to assume anything about your friend here, but yeah, on the other side, there is that like, well, how do I handle this man's emotions so that I'm safe, but so also that like, if he's a normal dude, you're trying to just let them down easy, but you're always on guard for a worse possibility.
Yeah.
And so the clear no is very hard to give.
Exactly.
And that's unfair for everybody.
Yeah, I was listening to a femininity podcast with one of the YouTubers I watch, and she was talking about like there is a little bit of hysteria about like how often like women think this bad reaction is going to happen, because like she's like 99% of the time the worst you're going to get is like a really harsh insult, but that's like really not that bad because they're going to walk away and they're not going to be creepy, right? It's the 1% of the time that it's really bad. it's like so it's, but people will say like, oh, like every time you say no something bad's going to happen. It's like, no, it's almost certainly not. But then it is. Then when it is, and then it's really bad. It's like, yeah.
You see, and it's really bad at the end of that, I think is really important, because if the stakes weren't so high, it wouldn't be so bad. If the 1% of the time was just rejection, it wouldn't be so bad. But, the worst case scenario often for women is death, assault.
Right.
Just horrific actions that no one should really be put through. And so it's just harder to navigate those situations.
Yeah, I do think that it's like important to like to display the numbers correctly, right? Like, but also, yeah, you have to be aware, especially when women are saying these things. It's because the worst case scenario is the worst case scenario, right? Like,
yeah, and if you always have to be on guard for it, like that's we need to fix what the worst case scenario is, and that obviously involves huge societal changes, so at the moment.
I have a thought on that. I think that like, because if you look at the numbers, it's most of it is like most like assaults on women are like serial, like they happen, like it's the same person doing it, right? So it's like it's hard to say like we're not doing a good enough job because we reduced it to this like specific population of men, right? And at this point it might be like, okay, well, if you're like serially assaulting women, like you might be a crazy person. Like we might have to do a better job of like we've told all the men to like get enthusiastic consent that we possibly can, and now it's time to like really look at this one population and figure out what the hell's wrong with them and why they're so violent and crazy and unacceptable to live in society, I think.
I think I wish I could believe that we have narrowed it down, but I think looking at the numbers I've seen, most women are assaulted by someone they know. And so you're not really on guard for the strangers, the person hiding in alleyways that all of the movies and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
make it feel like you are. But the fact that it's the people closest to you suggests to me that it happens when there's a disparity in power, because only someone very close to you would be able to have power over you in that way without the rest of society like being alerted, I guess. And I guess the most obvious example of this in the past was marital rape was legal,
Yeah.
and that's crazy, but it's not so crazy when you look at now and it's marital rape isn't illegal, but the people that are assaulting us are still the people closest to us, because it's only the people that we let close and that I don't want to say let have power over us, but the people that take power over women, I think those are the people we need to address. And I think that doesn't happen unless you fundamentally raise men understanding that women are your equals. And it seems like such a simple statement, but in one way or another, men are taught that women aren't their equals. Some men are taught that they aren't their intellectual equals, some are taught that they just aren't their equals whatsoever. But in some way, when men see women as lesser, especially the women close to them as lesser, that's what'll lead, to these situations we're talking about.
Yeah, it's hard. Hold on, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. I think that we're at the point when normal people are taking most responsibility for themselves, right? But I think it's the inability to intervene in other men's lives that becomes the serious issue, right? I know a lot of people who have a family member who is creepy, and they don't and they've talked about how their family just makes excuses for them, right? Right? And it's like, okay, so you all don't treat women badly or don't do weird things with, don't assault women. Okay, so why are you letting cousin Joe do it? Like, what is happening here? Why, like, they're like the person he's hurting is also your blood. So what if you can't make that excuse? What is going on? So yeah, I think that's I don't think it's like not first order, like first degree. I think most normal people take at least some amount of responsibility for themselves. I think it's like the second degree of the inability to intervene and go, hey, what the fuck are you doing? Why are we here right now? This shouldn't be a situation that ever happens ever.
I think that's a great point, and I think that is a very clearly like positive masculine thing. The ability to call out other men or even other women when they're displaying those traits of toxic masculinity, and like in this case, I know what you mean, because everybody has that like creepy uncle story or creepy cousin, or the like, or everyone's been warned about, when this person comes over, stay away. But why not just not invite them? Why not address the situation head on? And I think it comes from this tendency to not rock the boat and to just keep the peace, because a quiet peace is easier than tackling injustices and just uncomfortable situations head on. But I agree that that is something that's so essentially needed, is to just call out the people in our lives, especially because, you know, change is more likely to happen if the person respects you, or is close to you in some way. You know, like if some stranger on the street told me something, I'm less likely to take it as seriously than if my best friend told me that same thing. And so I think that if men see other men doing these things, then they should absolutely call it out. And I feel like that is something that has started to be called for, which is incredible.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that's one of the better modern things, right? Because we always have traditionally looked to men to like take charge and take action, but it's like, okay, like why weren't you taking action in one of the worst things that can happen to somebody you love for like the longest time? I feel like that's like that should be like boom, like that should be like right away, let's go. Like I don't know, I mean, and I'm a younger guy again. I've said this every single episode of the podcast. Don't consider myself like particularly masculine, but like, I mean, you saw me recently. Like it was like, okay, we need to figure out how to deal with this right now. Okay.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, and that's exactly what's needed, you know? Like, let's not keep the party going. Let's stop this and figure out what's going wrong. Call out what needs to be called out. Let's fix this in the moment.
mhm.
I think that that's great. I also think that men need to be more involved in the conversation, simply because the oppressors are never going to take the voices of the oppressed as seriously as they will their equals, you know? And this has always been the case. That's why in the fight against slavery, white voices were desperately needed. They shouldn't have been, but they were. Like, it's just the simple fact of it. And I think here it's the same, because, like it or not, like, the patriarchy is made to oppress women. It's made to relegate them to like a secondary position, because all of the things I would argue that are like traditionally masculine, everyone has those traits, but if a woman displays it, it'll just be labeled as something else. Assertive will be bossy, you know,
Yeah.
or naggy or whatever.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, we killed women. We killed the word bossy. Okay, as a culture in like the early 2000s, we slaughtered that word.
Amen. The baby's. I'm. There was a baby. Breadcrumbs.
Yeah. I think that just the wording that we use is also super helpful, because I think patriarchy isn't based on a system of privilege, it's based on a system of disadvantage, right? It's based on the level of how much disadvantage, like who can have the least amount of disadvantage, right? Rather than who can have the most privilege, right? Because really, we should be treating everyone like we treat the highest person, right? They're not treated better than we should treat people, right? You know, if you're like rich or white and a man and, you know, straight Christian or whatever the top one, right? Those people get treated like you should be treated, right? They're not getting treated better, okay? So I don't like to phrase that as them having privilege. It's that we have set up society so that everyone else has a disadvantage, right? And I think using that phrase might actually help people like rethink of it, because a lot of people will hear that and they're like, well, what, you know, white privilege, male privilege, like, you know, I grew up in a trailer, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, no, like what they're trying to say is, you know, you grew up in a trailer park and you were really poor, but one of the things that was holding you back wasn't also that you were a woman or that you were black or that, like, that wasn't like
Being white does not disadvantage you.
right.
In in most areas on the globe, being white does not disadvantage you. And so I guess that's fair. in my head, privilege is basically defined as having things that other people like. Let me rephrase. I think the fact that there are disadvantaged people, right? Like that there is a baseline that you're talking about, and yet some people are here means that everyone above them has more privilege than they do. But I agree that you're right, that like since this is the baseline, it's not that white people are like special or anything. It's just that we reserve like humanity and basic respect to one privileged group,
Right.
because just the fact that we reserve it means that it's their privilege and not just a right. So you're right, like all we're doing is we're disadvantaging these mass swaths of the population for one reason or another. And so if you find yourself disadvantaged and yet in one of those populations, it's really hard to look at yourself and say you are privileged, because really all it is that you have the privilege of not being disadvantaged and due to that characteristic, um, which sucks. I think either phrasing is fine, but I also understand that you identify as white and people are calling you privileged and you don't feel it for one way or another, then it feels like an attack on you.
Right.
And if for some reason you are male and people are saying that that's a privilege and you're just being you, then it still feels like an attack. But I think when you're part of the disadvantaged group, all you're really saying is that, like, well, whites have that privilege, so give it to me too.
Right.
Men have that privilege. I want it too.
Yeah, I guess I was always raised to associate like the word privilege with something special, right? So when I hear like privilege, it's like, no, that's not a privilege. That's like a basic human fucking decency. Like, what do you mean?
You know what? It sucks because it like obfuscates the word a little bit, because there are privileged people out there. There's
Right.
billionaires out there that like that do not deserve all of the privileges that they get to enjoy, especially the privileges that they get to enjoy due to them disadvantaging others.
Right.
Right. So it sucks that we're so stuck on the language of like of white privilege and male privilege, and I wish I could think of a third example because I keep going back to those two, but
straight privilege is another one, right?
Straight privilege, you're right, totally.
Yeah.
I should really know that. And I think it distracts us from really addressing the overprivileged among us. Because I don't despise a white person for not being, the target of racist police. I do despise billionaires. So, like, I just wish that language wasn't causing so much divide, because there's better uses of our energy.
Right. It's like you get into this fight over semantics, right? And it's like, okay, like I feel like we're missing the point of this whole conversation here, right? I feel like most of the time when you're talking about minority, like white privilege, you're like really saying like, hey, can we just be treated like white people are treated? Like that'd be so great, right? Or can we just be treated like men are treated?
Yeah, call it what you want, but can we just acknowledge that I don't get what they get, right? Like that's all that's being said.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the semantics are purposefully used so that we argue over nonsense. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's a vested interest in keeping us fighting over the semantics.
Right. Yeah. I think the left has pretty bad sloganing in general. I think it's like, yeah, oh, my least favorite one. This is not about masculinity, but it's like defund the police. It's like, well, no.
First one that popped in my head. Just
I'm like, that you need way more funding to do what you're actually trying to do, right? Like, you're not defunding anything. You're like doubling the funding.
yeah, like we do suck at slogans, and to be fair to us, I suppose it is because we are trying to build complex social structures rather than tear them down, which is super easy.
Yeah.
But yeah, our messaging needs to be better, because if you're trying to fund the social services, don't make enemies by saying on the police. Even if it's ultimately meaning less police are going out to certain calls, like that's not so much like defunding the police, that's just like reallocating our resources like we should have done ages ago. And defund the police is wording that makes enemies where you otherwise might not have them. Because I don't think that many people are against more mental health services. And, mental health service on demand in the instance of a crisis, instead of having cops in your face.
Right. Also, even if you're just focusing on the police, training them more costs more money. So if you want them to learn how to de-escalate situations, you're going to have to train them to do that, because clearly they don't know how to do that right now. So,
or even like, I wish the money wasn't being used on all of these surplus military equipment, and was being used on training, or maybe even just hiring to a better standard. Because there's been so much discourse on the fact that we kind of scrape the bottom of the barrel sometimes when it comes to our police forces, and that's bound to have consequences. But you're not going to get a better crop of applicants if the job sucks, if the culture sucks, if it continues to exist the way that it does exist.
Yeah, I know cops. Like, there are some people who become cops to be good people, because ultimately, like, no one complains about the fire department, okay? Because the fire department's full of heroes, okay? There's obviously some cops that are heroes, okay? But you can't, like, this is a situation where a couple bad apples can, in fact, ruin the bunch. Like, these are life and death consequences in which one of the people that are supposed to be heroes kills someone else, right? For no reason. And that's a dire consequence. It requires lots of training and it requires lots of vetting, right?
Definitely. Definitely. Especially because, unlike the cops, police gives you power over people. And power corrupts, It's a cliche. It's like, it's so easy to go back to because it's so true. And so if you don't want that to happen, you can't have any bad apples. Like, you're already in an environment that corrupts. You can't have anything that is going to further the spread.
Right. And it's going to happen, but it shouldn't happen as much as it does, right? It should be easy for it not to happen, hopefully, unless you're in like a crazy high crime neighborhood, in which case it's we don't have war zones in America, so it's like really hard to imagine a situation where the crime rate would be so high that like they're that on edge, right?
Right. But this isn't a podcast about that.
Jesus.
Training definitely is made to put them on edge,
Yeah.
But topic for another time.
So, back on topic, what do you think your least positive masculine quality is, or most negative masculine quality is? Traditionally masculine quality.
I'm pretty quick to anger. And I also shove it real deep down until it explodes.
Oh no.
And that's definitely very traditionally masculine, and also I think one of the more dangerous traditionally masculine qualities. Um, I think I definitely embody a lesser form of it solely because women aren't taught to like stamp down emotions in the same way. So I do end up, I guess, just letting the lid off a little every once in a while, especially with close friends of mine. Like when I can let off steam in a group and actually have like not just a sounding board, but people to help me um, process my emotions, then it's not so bad. But it is still a tendency of mine, and it is one of the reasons why I think it absolutely sucks that as a society we don't acknowledge anger as an emotion, specifically because it is, I guess not specifically because, but since it also happens to be one of the main ways men initially react to things, you know, then it makes it really hard for men to start addressing their own emotions, because you can get to the root of the anger, but if you don't even call it an emotion and you don't see it as something, I guess I should back up a little, because sometimes anger is seen as a positively masculine trait. No one really gets that surprised when men get angry.
Yeah.
It's just not out of the norm in the same way as when a woman has a violent outburst or just an angry outburst. So let me put my train of thought there. I don't know. I think I lost where I was going with that.
That's okay.
But
there's definitely some masculinity podcasts that I wouldn't approve of that love to say that like men are less emotional than women, and I would argue that like, okay, it sounds like you're not counting anger as an emotion because I feel like that would even it out a little bit,
It would, but men aren't allowed to be emotional, and so we just pretend anger isn't an emotion. And so that's why I say like sometimes it is something that's positively masculine or considered positively masculine, because no one's gonna judge you for being an angry man.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's an emotion, and if you don't acknowledge that it's an emotion, you're not allowed to handle it in the same way. You're not allowed, I shouldn't say not allowed, but it's just harder to get to the bottom of it and actually just resolve the anger.
Yeah.
I do want to back up real quick, because I think I wrote down for like most negative masculine quality, like in general, like if I wasn't looking at myself and just like traditional masculine, traditional toxic masculinity or traditional masculinity that I see, I think it's that in some cases it feels like for men to be masculine they have to reject anything labeled feminine. Even if you've got all of the other things like checked off, somehow like if you embody something that society deems traditionally feminine, it takes away from your masculinity. I think that idea is one of the most negative or toxically, masculine things that I've come across.
I would agree.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that like it's also frustrating because like your feminine quality as a man is infinitely more important than any set of masculine qualities. It's so interesting to me. Like you can be masculine in almost all of your life, and you do this and then you watch K-dramas or something. I don't know, right? And then it's just like socially that is infinitely more. You are infinitely more feminine, right? Even if you are like a
Right.
bodybuilder, you like
Yeah, you check off all the boxes, and yet, anything feminine that you embody will take away your masculinity. It'll lessen it, dampen it. And I think that's so toxic. I think that's where a lot of the traits of toxic masculinity come from, is that it feels like they have to reject anything feminine. And I know that that's like society bearing down on us, because if you're told being masculine is this set of qualities and being feminine is this set of qualities, it's really easy to then fall into the black and white thinking of, well, if I have this, then it subtracts from this. I do think it's wild that, like you said, like one aspect, just watching K dramas or even maybe just being into makeup, will completely erase masculinity. It just feels like it's a reflection of how much society hates things that are feminine. And I struggle to say women, although, it feels like society hates women.
Um, I don't know if I think it's a hatred of women. I just think that like we've done such a good job about strengthening femininity since like the rise of the feminist movement, right? Which has been largely good. And I feel like we've done not a good job about making masculinity less fragile, right? Like femininity is so sturdy and we widen the box of what femininity can be, right? And you're still feminine. But like masculinity is still this really small, tight box if you really think about what masculinity is and means, right?
Yeah,
That's
it's incredibly rigid, and it demands that you conform to it.
right in a way that like at least modern femininity is like nowhere near, right? Like if you're like mostly feminine and you do one masculine thing, it's almost an enhancement, right? Like not because you're being more masculine, but like, oh cool, like this person is different, right? But like with men it feels like, for not even just from men but from women as well, like you have you have to be this body type, you have to make this much money, right? You're fitting into this like really tight box.
hmm I think I think that that's a really shitty symptom of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
um, because you're right. Um, Women having masculine qualities is seen as a plus. And I think it's because, patriarchy centers men. And so women are that othered category. And so if the othered person displays qualities that we typically assign to the like in group, that's a good thing. That means, you're more acceptable to a degree. You stay in your role or else there's something wrong with you.
Hmm.
But those traits are still seen as a positive thing. Whereas if you're starting to embody things that we have othered, and we have like deemed lesser, then you're diminishing your masculinity. It is no longer an enhancement to have that quality from the other group, because the other group isn't seen as equal, seen as worse.
Right.
Which,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay. How do you think traditional masculinity has helped or failed you?
Hmm. I I have to come back on how it's helped me, but I have, everyone has grown up in a pretty patriarchal society, but I don't know if you know anything about it. Is very rigidly patriarchal, and I do think
Can we?
that growing
You said I don't know if you know anything about. I missed the
like
word.
Egyptian,
Okay. All right. Cool.
like it just like my culture specifically, it's very um, patriarchal and just male centered, and I think I think that it made me realize pretty early on that, oh, even if I am exactly the same as that guy, I'm still less, like in the eyes of my community. And it was really weird. We grow up in America, and our generation had, more than most, I would say, has really like embraced this idea of um, equality and feminism. And so, like, interacting with my own community and constantly seeing um, these, I guess, more archaic ideals in place, it was just very jarring. And I think it led me to detaching from a huge part of my culture due to that aspect of it, just due to that one, I wouldn't say small, but foundational piece.
Yeah, because well, I don't even know how you would engage with, like, how do you even engage with your culture if your culture is like, well, you're lesser for just being born literally just being born the way you were born, right? It's a biological thing, right? It's not even like
Right.
it's psychological, like, yeah,
And like, and it's so insidious because like I would run into these ideas even at like church. And I mean, I'm not religious at all, but back then, growing up, they teach you that like a woman should submit to the men in her. And my church, it's pretty progressive. So you can ask questions, but they never really had these satisfying answers because women being lesser was so foundational to the idea of our culture that like there is no real answer that they can give you when you ask like, well, why? Why do I submit? And so I think that definitely affected me. Um, I'm sure like it still continues to affect me because I feel like there's this major part of my culture that I fundamentally can't agree with. Let me think about how it's worked for me because
it doesn't have to be traditional masculinity as a whole. Like, it can just be like a piece that you took off and you're like, I like this, I'm gonna take it.
hmm, I actually I do have an example of traditional masculinity working for me, even though like while I was in the situation, it was pretty uncomfortable because for a while I didn't like have a steady income and I was already dating my boyfriend Bubbly at the time. And he kind of just fell into the provider role. And it felt easier to not question the dynamic, even though in my head I was like, this is unequal, this isn't right. But because I had no way of fixing it at the moment, I just let it be. And that is definitely a way that, like, traditional masculinity someone else has embodied has helped me. Um, but at the same time, like, as soon as I got my job, like, that shit had to go out the window. And I was like, I it's almost like overcompensating, like, trying to prove that not only that I don't see him as needing to fit that provider role, but that like the whole idea, like doesn't need to be the way we do things.
Yeah, that's understandable. Yeah, that's good. Those are good answers. Good.
Yeah, if I can think of something else, I will. But I feel like that was the most immediate thing to come to my head.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see what do we got. Do you think society is trying to remove some positive aspects of masculinity?
I think society is certainly trying to get rid of the aspects of masculinity that I seem positive. Um, because because if you look at the media that we're surrounded by and the concepts we're surrounded by, it definitely doesn't feel all that influenced by the social consciousness that we have about masculinity and like the current ideas that are circulating about masculinity. It still feels like society is trying to hang on to that idea of the man must be the provider, the woman must stay home, even though it doesn't match reality anymore. I really wish I had some like examples of how I see society suppressing positive masculinity, but it's just so hard to come up with examples of positive masculinity that I've seen in the first place, you know?
Um, I'll give you some recommendations, actually.
Right?
You gotta watch Vinland Saga. I know I've recommended this before, but that's a
Okay.
in
That's
Vin-
it's on the list.
it's my favorite piece of media of all time. So I can't recommend it enough. um, Invincible seems like it's dealing with that in the second season, and then the God of War Ragnarok, the second one is definitely there's definitely a lot of well, especially in the first one, and then in the second one, it continues into the second one. It very much deals with positive masculinity and like how we can redefine masculinity to better ourselves. At least I think all three of these. Well, I don't know how Invincible's gonna go because they're definitely telling a different story than the comics, but the other two definitely is more internal than societally. So maybe that's why it's been more digestible and accepted. Because it's just dealing with the internal. But I think that's also important because if you don't have a healthy internal locus of like who you are and like how to operate, like there's no way you're gonna make your immediate surroundings better, I think.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, I watched the first episode of season 2 of Invincible, and that was wild. So I'm I'm in for the ride on that one, but I will definitely be checking out the other two. God of War Ragnarok, is that the video game?
Yeah.
I have vague memory. Okay. I might have watched snippets of that when my friend played it a couple years ago. Maybe I'll have to try it myself.
Yeah, I was glued to the screen watching that. It was so good.
Yeah. But yeah, I really do wish that there were examples of positive masculinity that I could come up with, but I think even that is a pretty clear indication that society doesn't really put forth good examples of positive masculinity very often.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, I think I was talking about this with Nick too. I think like a lot of times a lot of the men that we put forth are like I pose this question that I want to start asking people when I get people who are going to be combative or who the podcast might be we have a little bit more disagreements on masculinity with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that Captain America or Iron Man are more masculine? Is more masculine? Like, who do you think is more masculine out of those two? Because there is a right answer and there's a wrong answer, I feel like. Right? Because a lot of people would say one, and I don't think that's the right answer.
Interesting. So having not thought about this at all past this last 10 seconds, I would say Captain America is probably a better example of positive masculinity. But I don't know why that is my gut reaction.
Well, traditionally, like viewing it through the lens of like the patriarchy, you should say Iron Man because Iron Man gets the most money, has the most women.
All the time.
Right.
Sorry. Go ahead.
He gets the most money. He has the most women. Okay. He is in charge of the team. Okay. He's like hyper skilled at like all the text things that he does. Right. All the stuff. Right. He's like college educated. He's right. Okay, but if you're looking at it through like the lens of like all the good aspects of masculinity, it's definitely Cap, right? He, yeah, he's the actual leader, even though like Iron Man's technically in charge because he pays for everything, right? He's the provider. He provides for the whole team, right? Yeah, but Cap is there. Cap, like, also part of this is that I'm not taking it just from the movies, right? But he's always the one reconciling with the team, right? He's always the one going there and making sure everyone's okay. You know, he's willing to step down when he needs to, right? He knows when he's not.
More emotionally available, which I mean, very positively masculine.
Right, and he's always the rock for everyone to bounce off of and like help them through their thing. Like he's willing to take the brunt of the hit, so to speak, right? Emotionally, so they can get through their emotional deal. So, yeah.
I think that's a really good insight.
But people,
I'm glad we agree. I'll probably be thinking about that more.
mm-hmm.
I think, circling way back, I feel like with superheroes, it's pretty easy to pinpoint more positively masculine aspects too, because first they're fictional, so there is that level of detachment, but also they're incredibly strong almost always, and with that power, I think always comes like all those masculine qualities, because we associate masculinity with power to a point, rightfully so, because they will always be the stronger gender. And so looking at them, it is pretty easy to say they're positively masculine in that they never use that strength against others, but in every other way, I think you're right. Iron Man is traditionally masculine, and I would argue toxically masculine.
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah, and like that's not a rip on his character. He's a very interesting character, right? I love Batman. Batman sucks. Like he's not a good person.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to catch me rooting for the billionaire here. So you're right.
Yeah, well, he's the fake kind. He's the kind that, like, you know, when Ronald Reagan is like, it's trickle in economics. He spends all his money on charity. He's the fake. He read too many Batman comics while he was running for president. You know.
Who wrote Batman? Is that why we got stuck with trickle down?
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, do you have any masculine role models in your life?
In my life.
Yeah. Or it could be, you know, fictional people. It can be anything. Fictional, real, historical, anything.
You know, I think this is one of those questions that my brain kind of skimmed over whenever I read the list, just because I was like, oh, I'll come up with something. It's been kind of hard to come up with role models. I think fictional, again, is a little bit easier. Have you ever watched Modern Family?
Yes.
I think Phil Dunphy is a pretty good example of a positively masculine person.
Is that the dad? Just
that is the dad. Okay. The dad of God, I don't want to call it the main family, but the one with the 3 kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, the goofy one. I think he's very positive masculine, because even though he is a provider, there is never any pushback when his wife wants to also, you know, go back to work. And that's just like one very deep in the season's example, but he's always just so confident in himself, even when being goofy, even when maybe doing something that isn't hyper masculine. I feel like there's this tendency of just people to like label anything that isn't hyper masculine as not good enough for masculinity. Um, so fictional, I think that. Uh, Real life, there's plenty of podcasts personalities that I watch that are pretty positively masculine. I listen to the like Behind the Bastards podcast, and everyone on there is pretty positively masculine, I would say. Um, and they very much are guys, which is good. I appreciate finally being able to like listen to men, the whole boys being boys thing, without any of the misogyny associated with it. It's great.
Oh, that term, like, it's so upsetting because it does mean something that could be useful, and now people have used it to just hijacked it to being like, just don't. Oh my god! Like sometimes they'll just be like, just let boys be boys, and it's like sometimes what you're saying is true. Like kids are play fighting in the back, like in the backyard. They're both having fun, and they're being safe. You don't have to interrupt them. Leave them alone. Let them play fight. Right? Boys will be boys. But sometimes it's like this boy is like pulling a girl's hair and harassing her, and then you say boys will be boys, and you're just like,
like don't ruin the term. Boys will be boys. Like it could be so wholesome,
Yeah.
And like it genuinely is, but the patriarchy has corrupted it for sure. So them. I feel like we haven't known each other very long for you to be a role model of mine, but I do think that you are one of those people that I met and was instantly like, oh, okay, this guy, positively masculine, not, he's on the up kind of thing. And I think that was, we followed conversations about everything, but I feel like one of the very first ones was a conversation about like the term privilege and white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And we weren't exactly in agreement at the start of it, but the whole time, like you make space for like when the other person is talking, which is something I would argue is not a traditionally masculine trait, but it's definitely something that's positively masculine. So, I'm trying to build more friendships like that.
Well, thank you. I love our talks. So, yeah, it's actually something that I've worked really hard on because I'm when I was growing up, I was the quieter kid. So it's like it's hard a lot of times. I'm like trying to figure out how to like switch between like not dominating the conversation or totally like it's just constant switch, right? So I don't do well with like crowds. I don't do with crowds. I constantly feel like I'm either dominating or I'm just saying nothing and everyone's looking at me like, why is this guy in this corner right now? Like, what's he doing? So, but one-on-one I'm getting more like acclimated and stuff.
I think even just being cognizant of the fact that you may be dominating a conversation and maybe it's time to step back or maybe even just equal out the conversation. I think that's something that definitely needs to be more widespread because I think that also would very much help combat things because women aren't taught to be assertive, and I feel like if men are taught that being dominating in every aspect and in every conversation takes away space from others, then we would probably have more effective conversations.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why I did this podcast, right? And yeah, I don't know if you noticed, but like normally I'm a little bit more active in conversations, and this I wanted to make space for other people to talk. So like I'm trying to let everyone go as much as possible because it's important to hear other people's ideas, right? That people are going to get to hear me speak every week. I'm not worried. I don't know. I'm not worried about it. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Oh wow, we've hit the last question.
Yes, we have. The last question is, what do you think about the term positive masculinity? Because previously it was healthy. Like I'm trying to switch to like positive and negative masculinity rather than toxic and healthy masculinity because those terms are starting to mean nothing, right? and so we have to switch away from those terms that mean nothing now, which is frustrating. But yeah.
I like the term, and I definitely wish I had more interaction with the term. It would be great if this were a word people use to combat toxic masculinity, because while it is so great that we can like point to bad behaviors and say that's wrong, like if you can't provide people an alternative, then what are you really doing? You know, like calling out injustice isn't enough. You need to give a realistic path forward. And I feel like this phrase does that. And it also, if it were more widespread, then it would be a way in which people could connect with those ideas. Because for men, especially men that don't need to be told what toxic masculinity is because they may not embody it as much, it may still be a struggle understanding how to be positively masculine and positively masculine towards men and towards women. So I'm excited. It made me very sad that during lunch today, I was like, let's see what the world thinks about positive masculinity. And so I put that into the search bar, and I just got like example after example of toxic masculinity instead. And so I do think that there is going to be a struggle in defining positive masculinity away from not quite misogyny, but I don't know how to put this into words exactly, because there is this aspect of like men's rights activism that I've noticed that is trying to move away from like being so wrapped up with women, but in doing that they just become like, I don't know, they just like take it to the extreme. Like, we want nothing to do with women, you know, like she should be chasing you, don't ever chase her kind of thing. Like like just taking it to the complete other extreme. I don't know.
It's so I think that when you don't give people a good off-ramp, right, especially like the left has a problem doing this in general with like privileged classes, we'll say, right? We'll say like, oh, America is like a racist nation, or, you know, society is like misogynist, or there's like rape culture. It's like, okay, so what's the off-ramp? Okay, I don't want to live in a racist society. What's the off-ramp? You know? And there's never yeah, what's the off-ramp? Because eventually we need to be able to cross that off of our big board of problems in life, right? So how do we get it? How do we cross it off? And I feel like we haven't done a good job with any of these things that I just named, but also with men, right? Being like, okay, cool. So how do I, as a man, support women, be like a feminist, and not be a misogynist? And then you ask all these feminists and all these women, or, you know, and they're like, I don't know, man, just don't be toxic. And you're like, cool, thanks, great talk. This is wonderful. This is great. This definitely helped me.
I think part of it definitely just comes from the fact that you're asking how to be not toxic, you know, instead of how to be good. But I don't know, it just I don't know how to explain to people that they should like have empathy and like just be good to their fellow man. I do know how to call out like the problems.
Yeah.
But you're right, like where is the off ramp from there? What is the solution? Because if we're just constantly calling out the problems, we're not having a productive conversation. Right. So I think that this is a great phrase And I hope that when I end up looking up the hashtag again, that hopefully the definition has like started to change.
I hope so too. Yeah, I definitely. It definitely is like it's hard because I feel like women want masculine men, right? In general, most women they desire masculine men. So it's like, okay, so it's you can't throw that whole thing out because if you like, all right, cool, you know how I don't be toxic, I'm just don't be masculine. It's like, okay, cool, have fun not finding a partner because that's it's not going to be easy for you at this point. So it's like you have to keep it, then you have to find out how to practice it in a way that's healthy for yourself and healthy for others around you. So this like weird, this weird like Schrodinger's cat, right? Of like what do you do at that point?
Yeah, for sure. Um, I don't know. I think this is a great way to start defining it.
Yeah. All right. Um,
Oh,
so do you have it? Oh, sorry. What?
no, I was just looking at the time. That was a good conversation.
Yeah, it's about right. We perfect timing of when we normally finish. It's about the ones without B rolls are about an hour and 15. So it doesn't look like we have any questions.
Yeah.
So is there anything you want to shout out? Anything you want to talk about regarding masculinity?
Um, Not at the moment. I feel like it's constantly on my mind, you know, but unless I'm interacting with it, I don't have immediate examples.
Okay, that's right. So now this is going to conclude. I need to update some settings because this is going to conclude